Hey everybody, it's Joe with the How To Guys, and today I'm going to show you how to replace the ignition on a 1980 GL1100 Goldwing. So let's get started. First I'll tell you how I knew I needed to replace the ignition, and it started with it being difficult to get the key to stay in the on position. It was even slipping over into off sometimes while I was driving and I'd lose power. And then the second issue is that if I adjusted my headlight angle, I would lose power to the bike. And I opened it up and found that there was no shorts in the circuitry in the headlight. And I'll show you in a minute that that comes from the headlight hitting the ignition behind the headlight housing. So let's get out into the garage and warm it up because it's about 15 degrees here. So we're gonna start a fire and get things all toasty in the garage so that we can get back to work on the bike. And we're gonna start off by taking off the battery, disconnecting it just because we're going to be working with the electronics. I don't want to short anything out. So I'm just going to disconnect the negative and the positive under the side cover here. Then we need to get behind this headlight housing. So I'm going to take off the screw that holds the front of the headlight housing on, pull that out, and then pull the headlight housing off of the bracket, so unscrewing both sides of that so that I could get that out of the way. And then you can get a better look at the problem I was having. See the back of the ignition switch here, it needed pressure on it in order for the bike to have any power. And that's because I think over time this aftermarket headlight housing was so deep, it was pushing on the back of the ignition switch and deformed it over time so that the connection between the 6-pin back and the ignition switch just needed that pressure. So to address that kind of weird issue, I used a heat gun and the fireplace a little bit and a hammer to heat up and pound out the back of that headlight housing. I didn't feel like buying a new aftermarket headlight housing, and I figured no one would ever see. So you can see here I made some space so that it's not butting up against the back of that ignition switch anymore. And so now I could get down to the meat and potatoes of switching out that ignition switch. And it has 2 screws, one on either side. You access this thing from the back of the gauge cluster, so you don't have to take your gauge cluster apart. So I would use a ratchet and a deep socket. I'm pretty sure they're 10 millimeter, if I'm remembering correctly. And they take a little while to get out just because there's not a very good angle. You can see here there's the hole on the ignition switch where the bolt goes through. So now I'm ready to move on to the other side. And you can also see here, besides the other side screw, this black part that you can see on the back of the ignition switch, that's the 6-pin back. And I think that's what was going wrong with the headlight housing, whereas the key problem I was having where the key was slipping, that's going to be a problem actually with the ignition switch. So I'm going to swap both those out. So I got the screws undone, and you can see here I just pull the ignition switch out the back towards the front, out the back of the gauge cluster towards the front of the bike. And then to mess around with the 6-pin back on it, you need the key in the accessory position. So I put the key in the accessory position, and then we have a couple of tabs we need to get undone. So first, to get that 6-pin back to the ignition switch disconnected from the wiring harness of the bike, there's just a tab there that you can see. Now the ignition and the 6-pin back are free from the bike and a lot easier to deal with. So then there's just these 3 pins here, these 3 plastic tabs that you can push in and pull that back of the ignition switch off. And I've seen videos on how to just repair this, but mine looked pretty worn down. So I'm just gonna replace everything here for ease. So I ordered an ignition switch offline. I think I got this from Saber Cycle. I'm not positive, but here's the part number. And the cool thing about this one, as I open it up here, is you can see that this one comes with that 6-pin back already with it. So I didn't have to buy a replacement for that. In this case, it's white instead of black, which was already the one on my bike, but that's no problem. So I put the new keys in and put it to accessory and just connected this up to the wiring for the bike. And then you'll just have to kind of finagle it back in to place. You want to get it back under the wire, all the wiring, and then slide it back up into the gauge cluster. And then when it's in position, you can replace those two bolts, one on either side, going in from the back of the gauge cluster or from the front of the bike, and snug those up nicely. And then you can go ahead and put your front end back together, whether you have a fairing or, in my case, the headlight housing. So you can see here as I'm putting the wiring harnesses for the headlight and the parking light back in, that the headlight housing is a little bit stubbier now. Once I get it all put back on the mounting brackets and the headlight front put back in, the lens put in, no one will be the wiser that I pounded the heck out of it. So just put that set screw for the front lens back in, and then reconnect the battery real quick, put the side cover back on, and then I'm ready to, for the moment of truth, to check out that the bike is actually working. So let's see if she'll start up in this cold weather. Power's good. All right. One thing that I'm really excited about with this is that now I'll have ignition keys, and then I'll be able to still open my glove box and my helmet lock with the old ignition key, so I can keep the bike running and still get at those locks. Good luck with your repairs.